and Public History Institute. So what we're about is, yes, collecting recollections of our elders, that's the oral part, but then bringing it to our general public and particularly young people, that's the public part. I did give a talk to which Andrea alluded at the University of the Bahamas last November about the Bahamian involvement in World War I. But this evening, actually, I want to forego that lecture. I want to give the spotlight to Mr. Etienne Claes. So I just have some very brief remarks which actually center on our young people and history. On the whole, I think we can probably agree that our young people don't find in history their first preoccupation, let me put it that way. I'm told that basketball is claiming the attention of a lot of our young men, and I don't think that's any surprise. I myself am a fan of Buddy Hield, and he has carried me into basketball, and if he could carry me, he's carrying a lot of people. I think sport in general actually seems to be a compelling area for our young men. And that really stands out in my mind because a few years ago, a young man was brought to the Institute, and he was described as having to make a choice between history and baseball. A future in history and a future in whatever the professional association is called in baseball. He went the baseball route, and that sort of gave me a sense of the temperature in terms of the interests of our young people. What emerges plainly is that we need to do some work in exposing our young people to our past. I'm at the university, and I was in a meeting recently where a professor in music said that he was teaching a course in music history, but his challenge was to educate young people about that political, social, military scaffold on which he could then hang the music dimension. I say that, and I could give more examples of my point, that there's much work for us to do in making history something exciting and engaging and compelling for our young people. But why make that effort? What's the point? I think there are implications for ignorance about our past that are sobering for our young people, for our elders, for our community. I like to quote a young colleague, not yet 30, who speaks of how her generation needs to know the story of which they are a part so that they can discern clearly the chapter of the story that falls to them to write. And I don't think I could put it any better. That orientation, that perspective from the past lets us know where we're going. For our elders, I think it would do so much for them if they knew that their accomplishments, their exploits, when they were young, are remembered, and that is something that we're not doing sufficiently, transmitting, the story of what our elders have accomplished, and we deny to them the opportunity to inspire young people by their example. On this note, I would just add that if our community finds itself with leaders who lack historical perspective, then we are not likely to have leaders who can project into the middle and the far distance in terms of our nation-building exercise. So having painted that grim picture, let me then say how very fortunate then how very fortunate that just, 3 months ago, 2 months ago, in November, we were able to witness a fairly robust conversation about the Bahamas and World War I, or the Great War, and that our children were able to be exposed to that conversation. What stimulated the discussion was, of course, the fact that last year, 2018, was the 100th anniversary of the ending of the Great War. And in response, we saw here the Bahamas branch of the British Legion putting on a fairly robust body of programming that was aired on television and brought to the public. The university did its part in conjunction with the honorary consul representing the Kingdom of Belgium to the Bahamas in terms of mounting an exhibit in the library and mounting a series of public lectures as well. And then I was so pleased to see in the Tribune that there was a supplement published that was quite extensive. I'm sure most people saw it, about World War I and highlighting roles played by our veterans. And all of this got people talking. It even got my family talking. And you wouldn't know, since I'm a professional historian, how silent. Excuse me just one second. I'm sure I put it on silent. I don't know. Anyway. So it got us talking. It turns out I have a great uncle, Wilfred Roberts, who fought in World War I. And as the family explored his background, we began to talk about challenges that he faced. We began to talk about post-traumatic stress. These things began to become real for us instead of just words on a page. Sacrifice. We began to put some grist on that mill. The conversation that developed in November, I hope that what some young people could take away was first of all, some basic facts about World War I, that it began in 1914, that it ended in 1918, that it was a brutal war. When we count the numbers killed, maimed, missing, it mounts to the millions. That it was a war that was centered in Europe, but it pulled in people from all over the world. That it was a war that opened the 20th century, but also shaped the 20th century, because it destroyed empires, it weakened other empires, and from our perspective, right in the belly almost of the shadow of the United States, it is the war that elevated the United States above Europe as the major player in the world economy. I'm hoping that our young people were able to take away that our community made a very significant financial contribution to the war effort, tiny in relation to the need, huge in relation to our resources, that we sent a significant number of men in relation to our population, that some of them came home and others didn't come home. That all of them, whether they were on the front line, which some of them were, or whether they were behind the front line, put their lives at significant risk. And that some of them acquitted themselves with such distinction in courage and in honor that they drew the respect of their fellow soldiers. So last November, I was very pleased to see this conversation, but I want to say that possibly another significant development that emerged from it is that it drew into the reclamation of our past Mr. Etienne Claes, the honorary consul from Belgium. He is on a chase now. I don't think he's going to give up the chase, He speaks with such passion about it. I get these long emails telling me the latest twist in the mystery. He's a detective, and what I'm hoping is that his narrative about the excitement of the chase can help to engage and interest our young people in thinking not only of basketball, because we don't want to take it off the table, and not only of baseball, but also of history. Mr. Claes, the floor is yours.
Can you still hear me? Yes, it's okay. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
As Andrea said and as Tracey said, do you actually need it?
Yes.
You do. Stop me if you can't hear me. I'm actually the Belgian consul of the Kingdom of Belgium in the Bahamas. I arrived here exactly 15 years ago. Well, give me 2 days. I arrived on the 27th of January, 2004. And to make a long story short, I loved it so much that I'm still here today. People have asked me, why is it that you put this exhibition together in the Bahamas? Where does this come from, this passion that Tracey just mentioned? And the explanation is threefold. First of all, I grew up as a Belgian with wars in general in my background from very early on. When I was in high school, when I was 13 years old, I was in a private school where we had to take Latin and Greek. And the first year in Latin, we were given these texts, and they were from, and I'll say this in Latin, De Bello Gallico, meaning the war in Gaul. And so, just to make sure that you understand, Belgium at the time, this is 57 BC, was a part of Gaul. Do you know what are these characters? Asterix. Have you heard of Asterix? This cartoon that speaks of how strong the Gauls were. And one of the things that Julius Caesar said about the Belgians, he said, the Belgians are the most ferocious and the most difficult to fight. Of course, we love to read that in our history books, and I'm 13 years old, and this ends up on my plate, and we have to read the battle reports of Caesar and translate them. The next thing you know is that when I'm a little bit older, we have a historical society in my town. And I go to one of the lectures, and they're telling me that what happened in 57 BC was one thing, but that in 887, which is more than 1,000 years ago, my town was raided by the Vikings, that they came up the rivers and that they destroyed my little town and killed most of the people that were in it. But there is some report of it. As you grow older and you go more into history, you discover actually that Belgium was the battlefield of Europe for the past 2,000 years, starting with the Romans, going via the Vikings, also the Huns arriving in 406, just south of the Belgian border, the Muslims or Islam arriving. You don't hear me very well? Okay. The Muslims arriving in 732 in Poitiers, which is a couple of 100 miles south of the Belgian border. And then the Spanish arriving in Belgium in the 1560s and destroying our churches, killing our villagers, taking our young men and put them in their armies. The next thing that you probably have heard of, and I'm skipping a lot of the battles that took place on Belgian soil, is 1815. Does that ring a bell with anybody, 1815? Does Waterloo ring a bell, apart from the fact that it's a train station in London? It's actually a town south of Brussels, where Napoleon was beaten by the English and the German armies. But again, 15,000 people died right there south of Brussels. You can visit it today. You can look at the battlefield, and that's barely 200 years ago. And then comes World War I. It was not the last one. We just mentioned World War II. The bigger part of World War I was actually fought in Belgium and the northern part of France. And yes, millions of people died. And I'm going to be talking about a small part of Belgium called Flanders Fields, where 600,000 people died and are buried. And that is what the exhibition that you saw when you come in is in fact about. It's also in my Belgian genes. This is not just something that I learned in school. But when I was a kid, my father, in the rare moments that he wanted to talk about it, was telling me how when he was 12 years old, in May of 1940, the Germans came for the second time. And my town, where I was born and where I grew up until I was 18, is about 30 miles away from the German border. And my father was 12, and he was the youngest of 4. His brothers and his sisters had left the house. And my grandparents grabbed him, and they threw him onto a cart that was drawn by a horse, and they fled with the Germans coming closer and closer, together with thousands of people. Most of the village was empty within 24 hours, and they went to northern France. They went actually to the same area where in the First World War, the Germans never could reach that because of what we will see in the panels later on. They waited for 3 months. They had to go and sleep in haystacks and ask people in northern France to give them food, and then things turned out to be okay. The Germans had just occupied Belgium, and there was the other thing, of course, what would happen later on is the Jewish question and the deportations. But in most villages, in the smaller areas, like the one that I grew up in, things got more quiet, and they just went back to their houses. My father was barely 16 years old when there was an incident right next to the farm where he grew up that he talked about to me, not when I was a kid, but it surfaced for the first time about 15 years ago in rather special circumstances. Belgium is a Catholic country, and on the 1st of November, we celebrate All Saints massively. It's the day that we all go to the cemetery. Or you go the day before or the day after and make sure that the flowers are nicely arranged on the grave. So in 2008, I actually, with my father, I walked into the cemetery where my grandparents, the same ones that fled to France in my previous part of the story, and there's a couple standing in front of 4 graves, just like these empty chairs. And I really never looked at these graves, but they were identical tombstones. And you will see the form of these tombstones again in the pictures over there. And they turned around when we walked by, and they spoke in English to my father. And they said, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" And my father by then used to me being all over the world and speaking